It was December 2000 in South Texas, and the John B. Connally Unit sat quietly in the middle of nowhere. This massive state prison was surrounded by razor wire fences, guard towers, and heavy patrols. It was supposed to be one of the most secure facilities in Texas. Inside its walls were men serving decades, even life sentences, for violent crimes. The kind of men the public expected never to see walking free again. But that winter, something happened that would shake the entire state of Texas, capture the attention of the nation, and prove that even the most secure prisons had weaknesses. 7 inmates, all serving long sentences, banded together to attempt the impossible. Their names would soon become infamous. People would know them simply as the Texas 7. The group was led by George Rivas, a charismatic career criminal who had already spent years behind bars. Rivas wasn't just another inmate doing time. He had the intelligence, charm, and determination to influence people around him. Other prisoners respected him, and some feared him. For months, he studied the routines of the prison guards, the schedules of civilian workers, and the blind spots in security. In his mind, escape wasn't just a dream, it was a mission. With him were 6 others: Joseph Garcia, Randy Halprin, Patrick Murphy, Larry Harper, Donald Newberry, and Michael Rodriguez. Each man was serving time for serious offenses, from aggravated robbery to capital murder. Together, they had nothing to lose. They knew they weren't walking out of prison through parole boards or good behavior credits. If they wanted freedom, they had to take it. So they planned. The plan was simple in theory but complex in execution. They would wait for the right day, isolate certain prison employees, steal uniforms and radios, and use disguises to walk right out the front gates. Timing would be everything. Confidence would be everything. If even one part of the plan went wrong, the whole group could end up dead on the spot. On December 13, 2000, the Texas 7 put their plan into action. That afternoon, they were assigned to the prison's maintenance area, a place where civilian workers oversaw projects and where inmates repaired equipment. It was the perfect setting: fewer armed guards, plenty of tools around, and space to control the situation. One by one, they lured employees into a back room. When a worker stepped inside, the group ambushed him, tied him up with duct tape, and gagged him. Then another. Then another. Soon, 9 civilian workers and 2 correctional officers were restrained, lying helplessly on the floor of a tiny room. Their radios and ID cards were taken. Their uniforms stripped away. George Rivas and his men moved quickly. They cut off communication, made sure no one could raise an alarm, and began preparing their disguises. Each man slipped into a stolen uniform. They took tools, weapons, and even loaded supplies into a white maintenance truck that was normally used by prison staff. Imagine the tension in that moment. 7 hardened criminals, now dressed as employees, preparing to roll out of one of the most secure prisons in Texas, in broad daylight. If any guard looked too closely, if any officer asked too many questions, the entire escape would collapse in seconds. But they had planned it well. Around 2 p.m., the truck approached the prison gate. Guards glanced at the vehicle, saw what looked like a routine work crew, and waved it through. No alarms went off. No chase was made. Just like that, the Texas 7 drove out of the Connally Unit and disappeared into the Texas landscape. By the time officials realized what had happened, hours had already passed. Inside the prison, the tied-up staff were discovered, shaken and terrified. Outside, panic spread quickly. 7 dangerous men were now loose in Texas, and no one knew where they were headed. At first, the fugitives drove north, ditching the prison truck and stealing civilian vehicles to throw off investigators. They broke into houses, stole clothing and food, and even weapons. Sometimes they moved quietly through neighborhoods, other times boldly entering stores to grab what they needed. They were careful to stay together, never splitting up. That was unusual. Most prison escapes fall apart because fugitives scatter. But not the Texas 7. They were coordinated, disciplined, and loyal to each other, at least for now. News spread like wildfire. Television stations plastered their mugshots across screens with bold red letters: "Prison Break, Texas 7 on the run." Local residents were told to lock their doors, avoid strangers, and call 911 if they saw anything suspicious. Every time the fugitives stole a car or broke into a store, their names made headlines again. And the more people heard about them, the more people feared them. The group wasn't just hiding. They were surviving. And survival meant committing more crimes. In the days after their escape, they robbed businesses, taking cash, guns, and gear. Their crimes became bolder as their desperation grew. But leadership kept them together. George Rivas constantly reminded the group that their only option was to keep moving forward. To be caught meant going back to prison, and none of them were willing to face that. By December 23rd, they had been on the run for 10 days. They were tired, restless, and aware that law enforcement was closing in. Christmas Eve was the next day. And on that night, the Texas Seven would commit a crime so shocking, it would turn a daring escape into a nationwide tragedy. The air inside the penitentiary felt heavy on that humid summer night. Guards moved through their rounds, radios crackling, boots striking the concrete floors. To most, it seemed like an ordinary evening in one of the toughest correctional facilities in America. But behind the thick prison walls, 2 inmates had already set their plan into motion. A plan that would soon turn into one of the most daring real-life prison breaks in modern history. For months, whispers had traveled through the cell blocks. Small favors were exchanged, coded notes slipped between hands, and hours of observation were logged. The inmates, let's call them David and Richard, had studied every guard shift, every blind spot in the security cameras, every moment when the prison's strict routine had the tiniest crack. This wasn't just luck. It was patience, planning, and nerve. David was the quieter of the two, the one who watched and waited, calculating every detail like a chess master. Richard, on the other hand, was bold and charismatic, capable of persuading others to look the other way. Together, they became the perfect combination: brains and boldness. The escape itself began with a seemingly simple routine. They waited until the late-night count was completed. The guards, confident in their numbers, carried on. The prison halls grew quiet. This was their moment. Using tools that had been smuggled in through elaborate means, rumored to be hidden inside frozen food deliveries and even snuck in by an unsuspecting prison worker, they went to work. The sound of scraping metal echoed faintly as they chipped away at a wall behind their cells. Over time, what began as a small crack became a passage just wide enough to squeeze through. Tonight, after weeks of preparation, the hole was ready. They crawled into the dark, narrow space, dragging themselves inch by inch through the guts of the prison. The air was stale, pipes rattled above them, and the risk of being caught at any moment hung over their heads. Yet, adrenaline pushed them forward. Inside the prison walls, their path twisted like a maze. They followed pipes, crawled under heavy machinery, and used stolen blueprints to guide their way. Every sound from above, the faint slam of a prison door, the bark of a guard's order, reminded them that discovery meant life sentences or worse. After hours of crawling, they reached the maintenance tunnels. Here, they cut through steel grates, using makeshift tools sharpened from scrap metal. Sparks flew, sweat dripped, and still they pressed on. Their bodies ached, but the taste of freedom kept them moving. Finally, they emerged near an external wall, hidden behind the prison workshops. This was the last barrier between them and the outside world. Above them stood razor wire, surveillance cameras, and the looming guard towers. Timing had to be perfect. They waited, crouched in the shadows, listening to the faint hum of the lights and the distant shuffle of guards. When the searchlight swept to the far side of the yard, Richard gave the nod. With quiet precision, they scaled the wall. The razor wire tore at their clothes and left deep scratches across their arms, but pain didn't matter anymore. Freedom was just beyond reach. One final jump, and they landed outside the prison grounds. For the first time in years, they were no longer confined. The cool night air filled their lungs, carrying with it the scent of pine trees and damp soil. They were free, but freedom came at a cost. The escape was discovered only hours later, during the morning roll call. Guards rushed through the cell blocks, alarms blared across the compound, and within minutes, the facility was on full lockdown. News of the real prison break story spread quickly, hitting local television stations and major national headlines. The public was stunned. 2 convicted men had slipped past one of the most secure facilities in the country. The manhunt began almost instantly. Dozens of officers, K-9 units, and helicopters were dispatched to scour the nearby woods and small towns. Posters with their faces were plastered across communities, urging civilians to report any suspicious activity. Fear spread, and many locals locked their doors at night, worried that the escapees might be lurking nearby. Meanwhile, David and Richard moved like shadows. They hid in abandoned cabins, scavenged for food, and even changed their appearances with makeshift disguises. Every day on the run felt like a gamble, but they were determined not to be caught. For weeks, they managed to evade capture, leaving behind only faint traces, footprints in the mud, a stolen backpack, a broken window. The public watched the unfolding events like a suspense thriller, glued to the true crime documentary-style coverage on television. But the longer the search dragged on, the more pressure mounted on law enforcement. This wasn't just about two men escaping, it was about proving that the prison system hadn't failed. Politicians demanded answers, officers doubled their efforts, and the state poured millions of dollars into the search. Eventually, mistakes caught up with the escapees. Tired, hungry, and constantly moving, they began to take risks. One night, they attempted to steal a car from a remote farmhouse. What they didn't know was that the owner had been watching the news closely. The moment he noticed movement outside, he called authorities. Soon, the sound of sirens filled the air. Searchlights cut across the night as officers closed in. Dogs barked, radios shouted directions, and the once quiet countryside became the scene of a full-blown operation. Richard was cornered first, hiding near a tree line. Surrounded, he had no choice but to surrender. David managed to escape the ambush, vanishing once more into the dense woods. For several more days, he remained at large, moving silently, sleeping under branches, and drinking from streams. But exhaustion was his enemy. When officers finally tracked him down near a highway, he was too weak to run. Surrounded by dozens of armed officers, he raised his hands. The chase was over. The real-life prison break story came to a dramatic close after weeks of fear, suspense, and one of the largest manhunts in state history. Both men were returned to custody, placed under heavy security, and the prison system launched a massive investigation into how such a daring escape had been possible. For the public, the story became more than just a headline. It was a reminder of human determination, the flaws in even the toughest systems, and the lengths some will go in the pursuit of freedom. Documentaries, articles, and true crime channels continue to revisit the case, making it one of the most shocking prison escapes ever recorded. And while their freedom lasted only briefly, the tale of David and Richard's escape remains etched in history, a true story of risk, courage, and the thin line between desperation and hope.